All right then. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Depends on where you're joining us from. But thank you so much for being with us today to discuss this very important topic, which is climate change and its effects on the Indo-Pacific nations. I'll keep my remarks very brief and reserve it towards the end. Let's get the session started. If we have our first speaker for today, Professor Rajib Shaw. If you can unmute and also you can start your video. Yeah. So Professor Rajib Shaw is joining us from Japan. He's a professor at Keio University. You can find the details of all the speakers in the booklet that has already been shared. Welcome, Dr. Shaw, and over to you for your presentation. Each one of you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and a very good evening from Japan. Uh, Thank you very much for inviting me in this very important platform. What I would like to express a little bit or share a little bit about the climate change in Asia, especially from my work in IPCC. In the screen, you can see different types of affiliations I have, starting from academia, science policy interface, startup innovation, and grassroots actions. But today, my main work is the one which I highlighted as the IPCC coordinating lead authors of the sixth assessment report. I was the CLA for Asia chapter. Before I go into the climate change itself, let me put five specific context, which I think it's very relevant, especially when we talk about more on the regional perspective. I'm not sure whether you are aware about this global risk outlook of World Economic Forum. This is published every year in January in the Davos meeting. So it talks about different types of risk and the color coding. The green ones are the environmental risk, then it has geopolitical risk, then technological risk, societal risks, and so on. These 4 years, 2020, 21, 22, and 23. When I say 20, it's the analysis of the previous year because the report is published in January. You can see that in 20, most of the, like there are quite a bit of green boxes, which are related to the environmental risk, which is climate change, extreme weather, then biodiversity losses, disasters, and so on. But if we go into 21, of course, that time we had already COVID-19. So we had infectious disease as one of the top risks. But there are new risks which arise because of our changing lifestyle, changing working pattern, changing education system, and so on. So the digital divides means we are very fortunate to have possibly a good connectivity, but not the whole world is equally connected. So this digital divide or digital power concentration became one of the critical risks. 2022, when we went more towards the different types of digital activities, cybersecurity becomes one major risk. 2023, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, which started in 2022, this energy crisis became one of the major risks. If you look at this year report, one of the critical thing was the misinformation and disinformation. I just give you one example here that in Japan we had a major earthquake on 1st of January this year. And after that, there were what you are seeing here in this particular screen, that there are around 370,000 posts in X, in Twitter, that this particular earthquake was due to nuclear explosion in North Korea. Then the Prime Minister himself, with some technical people, had to make the press conference to explain that this is nothing to do with the nuclear explosion. This is just a pure tectonic movement. So what I'm trying to point out here is that every year we are seeing many new type of risk for last 4 years. It's all listed here. The risks are becoming more interconnected. But if you see the little bit longer term perspective, the 10 years, like the future risk, extreme weather events, climate change, biodiversity losses, disasters, and so on, this becomes in the top risk in the longer perspective. So that's my context one. Context two, many of you are possibly aware about that 2015 we had all major frameworks. We had Sustainable Development Goal, we have Paris Agreement, we had also a very little bit less known, I will say, the framework, which is Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, SDGs for Development, climate change for, of course, the Paris for the climate change, and Sendai for the disasters. And we try to make some analysis of that, what these particular frameworks talk about. And we saw that there are quite a bit of correlation between development, disasters, and climate change. But I highlight one specific issue, this particular term called local. It has been used 10 times in SDG, 48 times in Sendai, 9 times in Paris Agreement. And my main takeaway from this particular analysis that although we talk about global framework, it has a very strong local implication. So that's my context number 2. Context number 3 is the CCA, Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction Synergy. The one which you are seeing in the top is from a disaster report, global assessment report. So where we are talking about this particular word, that living with uncertainty. I think more the world is becoming a different sense. Different, it's not only just the disasters in terms of the natural hazard, but also there are lots of war, conflict, geopolitical risk. So this living with uncertainty becomes one of the critical aspects. In the lower part, in this climate change report, which I will be talking 2022, this is on the left-hand side, this is the previous report, assessment report 5, where we tried to define the risk in terms of climate change, human society, ecosystem, and so on. Here we put all the three things the same, the future climate change, human system transitions, ecosystem transitions, but we talk about the climate resilient development pathways, like we need to possibly deal with the climate change, we need to cope with the climate change, how we go in future as a resilient pathways. So that's a very important context of 3. Context 4 is gradually we are seeing more complex emergencies. In 2020, in January, we published this book on public health and disasters, talked about the health emergencies, but we never imagined that this whole year we'll be spending more on the public health issues, which was COVID-19, and more it becoming, say, more complex emergencies. So public health, disasters, climate change, this becomes very, very interrelated. And the last context here is this digital inclusivity. So what you are seeing here is the percentage of people having digital access. This is a little bit old data, 2022. So 5.3 billion globally. Out of that, Asia has the largest digital connectivity, of course, because of its large population, almost 60%. But the important thing is this digital divide, what I say, this urban area last 10 years, the urban area and the rural area both have increased, but this gap of 15 to 20% has not yet reduced. And for that, Japan has started what we call the digital Denentoshi, which is the urban-rural connectivity. It was started by Kishida, the previous prime minister's cabinet in 2022. So mainly how we develop this digital human resource, I think that's a very, very important point. So based on these 5 points, let me just walk you through this IPCC report. So this was the report which I'm mentioning, especially this Asia chapter where I was the CLA. So we call the IPCC upper level statement, which are possibly very higher level statement, flood, regional drought, and fire. So these are becoming increasingly attributed to the human-induced climate change. Mortality then impacts on the species on land and ocean becomes very, very severe. In IPCC definition, we use this particular term called very high confidence or medium confidence. As maybe some of you know that in IPCC, what we try to scan all different types of scientific reports, the scientific papers. So when there are a large number of scientific papers talking to a similar direction, then the confidence level become high. So the heat becomes also, we have seen the increasing heat wave. That's also major challenges, and also different types of biodiversity losses. So in Asia, the characteristics, I think that these 4 specific things, one is the heat wave, coastal urban flooding, biodiversity losses, dust storm, sea level rise, and urban heat island. So this becomes quite important, and it becomes actually, these are not just isolated risk, and it's become very complex, compound, and also what you call the cascading risk. And for that, in this disaster risk reduction terminology, we often use this word called systemic risk approach. It's not just one system, it's a very, very integrated system, starting from human health to food security, agriculture production, livelihood losses. So it's a very complex phenomenon, and we need to identify that one and what we try to emphasize on this. So there are many different aspects. Again, for a limited time, I won't go into the detail of that. I just show you the three specific impacts. One on the agriculture system, then what are the in the urban systems, which are the cities, and another one is the health system. So and these three again are very interrelated. We are seeing more climate change impact on different, whether in terms of the flood, whether in terms of the lack of water, which is the drought, whether it's the heat wave. So there are different analyses in the Central Asia to North Asia to South Asia to East Asia, and differential impacts on the cities. On the agriculture part, there are many different crops which will have different types of quality problem, the yield problem, and possibly we need to have a very strong impact on the adaptation in the agriculture sector. The health impacts in climate change is also extremely, extremely important. We are seeing new disease in many cases, the waterborne disease as well as the vector-borne disease are coming or becoming more prominent, and those also health sector also becoming very challenging. So my last slide here is possibly means we can talk possibly hours on this climate change impact in the Asia Pacific region, but there are a few highlights. Again, I must say that there are lots of in-depth analysis. What I am telling is only a very short summary of this. One is that the cities in the whole Asia Pacific region is a very challenging issues, whether it is the water system, food system, job security. So the urban-rural connectivity becomes very important. Then we also have this maladaptation or short-term adaptation. In the name of the adaptation, what we do sometimes is a very short-term adaptation. Sometimes, say for example, when we have a water shortage, we try to extract lots of water from underground for the agriculture purpose, which is called the irrigation system. In many of the countries in the Asia Pacific region, they have developed very strong irrigation system. But we also need to think about that when we extract water, we also need to recharge our groundwater. So there needs to be a larger macro planning. So irrigation in agriculture is a short-term adaptation, but sometimes it may also create the maladaptation in certain aspect. We also need to think about the limits to adaptation, that in spite of different types of severe impacts of the adaptation, there would be severe limits. Say, for example, some of the species in the coral that will definitely disappear. Then also, say, for example, small farmers or small landholders, they have limits to the adaptation because it is very much impacting on the agriculture sector and all these different issues. And this particular report, I would like to use these particular terms like this whole aspects of the climate resilient development, which needs to be inclusive, which needs to have a very strong governance aspect, which needs to be multi-stakeholder and different types of urban-rural connectivity. So with that, again, what I could possibly share is a very small part of this very large and complex issue, but I look forward for the future discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Keeping to the time, and also realize if I was a speaker, it would be practically impossible to wrap up in 10 minutes, but you have been very kind. So I can't see our next speaker here. So I'll go to the third speaker, and when Dr. Dhanashree joins, or if she joins, then we'll come back to her. Our next speaker is Miss Judith Mwaniki. She's the Director of Consortium of Economic Research and Development Studies from Kenya. Over to you, Dr. Judith, and you have 10 minutes. We will come back to question answer towards the end of the session.
Thank you, Dr. Ojha. I'm not sure if you can hear me from your end. My apologies, my network connection is a bit shaky.
We can hear you and we can also see you. So you can start your presentation now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I must start by congratulating the NIST team for organizing and putting together this forum. And a big thank you to the organizers for planning this particular panel and inviting me to speak as we deliberate with experts and scholars and look at the issue of climate change at a global level and its effects on the Indo-Pacific region and the global South at large. The current status of climate change actually troubles me, and it really is an issue of concern, looking at the world and where we are, and thinking of the world that we'd want our children to inherit and the world that we leave behind for them. But it also brings me joy to have sessions such as this and have people like the esteemed panelists in this panel so that we discuss and have meaningful discuss on this matter of profound global urgency. For me, it's both a privilege and a call to action speaking at this forum today. And speaking from a Kenyan perspective and maybe also an East African perspective, and standing in solidarity with nations across the Indo-Pacific region, where we are united by our shared challenges and opportunities in addressing one of the most pressing issues of our time, that is climate change. We appreciate how much cooperation amongst ourselves will be the solution, will be one of the most effective solutions to helping us addressing this issue of climate change. I know that the Indo-Pacific region, one, is home to over half the world's population, but then also with this population encompasses diverse ecosystems, cultures, and economies. So making it a region of immense diversity and spanning from small islands, dynamic coastal economies, and vast agricultural lands. It is therefore of very strategic importance. And extending beyond geography, it embodies both our vulnerabilities and resilience that define the climate narrative of the globe and of the global South as well. The region is a microcosm of opportunities and challenges that we face in the 21st century. Today, I will want to focus on the three critical components of climate action, and I look at adaptation, mitigation, and climate financing. And even as we look at these three components, we cannot forget a just energy transition, because even as we look for climate solutions, these have to be equitable, leaving nobody behind. And together, these pillars will form the foundation of our collective efforts to combat climate change. We all agree that climate change is a global crisis whose implications are far-reaching. The world is currently grappling with rising temperatures, erratic weather patterns, and sea level rises that affect all regions. Their manifestations differ though, based on geography and socioeconomic context of the regions. So climate change now continues to supercharge devastation from the effects. And we are seeing tropical storms, heat waves, and floods across the globe. The East African region, for instance, after coming from prolonged drought for about 3 years, then again this year has been a wet year, and we are seeing flooding across the region. So it feels like we are oscillating from one extreme end. If it's not drought, again, it's flooding that we can't even control. And these have led to unprecedented economic challenges and untold human suffering, because again, this affects the livelihoods of people, especially across the region. The climate catastrophe is hammering health, continues to widen inequalities, harming sustainable development and rocking the foundations of peace. The vulnerable, who are definitely we who live in the global South, are the hardest hit. Maybe looking at some statistics, this year actually is going to be the hottest year on record. and the first in which the average global temperatures will exceed 1.5 degrees C, above the pre-industrial period levels. Even as we continue to try to put in efforts to cut emissions to net zero, and as many governments continue to pledge to eventually support the populations to cut emissions, and looking to stop global warming from getting to us, these pledges, somehow we still end up with having the highest carbon emissions. And again, this is set to be these are set to hit a record high this year. The East African region has over 4 million people who faced food insecurity due to drought in the year 2022. While again, like I've said, we experienced flooding within this year that displaced again a very big number of people. However, even as we look at these extremes, and even as we look at our individual and collective responsibilities as nations, we need to maybe deliberate on how we can cooperate in terms of addressing the issues that affect the Indo-Pacific region. So the region, again, when we look at rising sea levels, statistics show that there is about a rise of an average of 3.3 millimeter per year. And this leads to endangering of small island. And also, I think we're also seeing the same happening within the East African region, where the lakes within the Great Rift are having rising water levels. And interestingly, nobody understands, but these are part of the effects of climate change. So these regional nuances underscore the need for tailored strategies, which will align with local realities and promote global cooperation. There is a need for urgent, well-coordinated climate action that addresses these impacts. And therefore, we need to actually, this is actually like a call to action before it's already too late. When we look at adaptation, this is necessary for us to build resilience to climate impacts. And it's essential for communities to safeguard against the adverse effects of climate change. For the East African region, we talk a lot about climate-smart agriculture, which has emerged as a lifeline, enabling farmers to withstand erratic weather patterns and sustain food production. Part of what we talk about is growing drought-resistant crops, which have always been like our local land races and that require less water, meaning that we are securing the livelihoods of farmers and also ensuring that we're able to produce enough for our own consumption. There is also incorporation of techniques such as intercropping, agroforestry, and water harvesting, which have proven effective in enhancing our resilience. We look at improved water management, especially to reduce the risk of floods when it rains, which actually has helped to safeguard livelihoods, and especially like for Kenya in our Tana Basin, which over years has always had these issues. And again, when we look at from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the country's national adaptation plans, even though there really is still a lot left to do, it's still a step towards addressing, systemically addressing climate vulnerabilities. And if we look at across the region, we need to acknowledge that adaptation is not a choice, but a necessity. But this will require a substantial investment and political goodwill to scale up the initiatives and make the initiatives now for adaptation accessible to vulnerable populations. And this way we will safeguard the population's livelihoods. But even then, even as we look at adaptation, we cannot underplay the role of mitigation, and especially in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Because, well, adaptation will address the symptoms, but mitigation will target the root cause. And a significant part of mitigation will involve transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. I am proud of my country, Kenya, because currently our energy mix is over 75% renewable, thanks to investments in geothermal and solar power. Again, here geothermal currently provides for more than 47% of Kenya's electricity. And these successes demonstrate the potential for renewable energy to drive economic growth, even as we combat climate change. And similarly, this across Indo-Pacific particular strategies that have been taken up, harnessing the abundant solar, wind, and hydropower resources to accelerate shift to clean energy and reduce dependence on fossil fuels. And therefore, even as we continue looking at how countries and nations across the Indo-Pacific, such as Indonesia and Philippines, continue to make strides with solar and wind energy, we must acknowledge that coal still accounts for quite a huge percentage of energy production in most countries. And under the Paris Agreement, countries have committed to their NDCs, which outline their plans to reduce emissions. However, mitigation efforts must also include reforestation and sustainable land use practices. For instance, in the East African region, we continue to have reforestation initiatives. In Kenya, we have what we call the Kenyan Greenbelt Movement that serves as a model for large-scale carbon sequestration projects. And these are probably part of what we can look at as nations in the Indo-Pacific region, as in terms of knowledge sharing, and also looking at how we can work together to continue addressing the issue of climate change. Even as the nations in the global south continue to work very hard to ensure that, one, they are making great strides towards adaptation and mitigation, the global north needs to step up, because again, they are the bigger contributors. Actually, if the global south just did by their own efforts, we really would not be making any strides towards maintaining a less than 1.5 degrees C. And when we look at climate financing, there is need for the global north to support the global south to bridge the resource gap, because adaptation and mitigation will require significant financial resources, and these often exceed the capacities of developing nations. Climate finance, whether through international mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund or regional partnerships, is crucial for bridging this gap. Equitable access to climate financing must be prioritized to ensure the most vulnerable communities can implement effective climate solutions. For instance, the smallholder farmers in East Africa, for them to adopt climate resilient technologies, there's a need for funding. And not just that, there's also a need for us to invest in research that advances their efforts towards implementing effective climate solutions. Again, for the small island nations of the Indo-Pacific region, they require resources to maybe build seawalls or relocate their at-risk communities. There's also a need for South-to-South cooperation. And this is an opportunity for knowledge sharing and resource mobilization. Africa and the Indo-Pacific nations can collaborate on innovative financing model. And also noting that our communities are very similar in our ways of life. And also because we are so reliant on the environment for our day-to-day sustenance, we can borrow from each other on issues such as community-based adaptation, funds, and microinsurance schemes that address localized needs. But even as we look towards all this, we cannot forget the issue of a just energy transition, which is an inclusive path forward. The shift to renewable energy must be fair and inclusive, ensuring no one is left behind. A just energy transition will acknowledge the social economic realities of communities reliant on high carbon industries, because again, we cannot just look to transition without thinking of the livelihoods of the people that are around the ecosystem of high carbon industries. And there's need to provide pathways for alternative livelihoods. For instance, in Kenya, we in the need to ensure a just
Judith,
energy.
I would I'm so sorry for interrupting, but please wrap up.
Thank you. I'm wrapping up in the next 1 minute. So we have solar mini grids that actually have brought electricity to more than 700,000 rural households and reducing dependency on kerosene. We also have a lot of initiatives around ensuring that rural households transition from use of firewood to use of LPG. And now again, which now trickles down to not just protecting our forests, but also has health benefits to the people. So the Indo-Pacific region and East Africa may be separated by oceans, but we are united by a shared mission to combat climate change and secure the well-being of our people. And together, we can build a future that safeguards livelihoods and ensures food security and protects our planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me quickly move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Ornela Cuci, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Dr. Cuci is former Deputy Minister of Tourism and Environment of Albania. So over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me and for having me here. Also, I have been a part of the GCF board representing the East European and Central Asian countries for many years, and also a council member for JEF and the representative of the ECA region for JEF for their replenishment process. And in this case, also I have done in my academic work, I have done some analysis on the adaptation funds, the multilateral adaptation funds in the last 10 years. And but except this academic analysis, which show to all of us that our developing countries will suffer more and more from climate change impact. And I'm coming from a country, Albania, that we are the more attacked country from climate change in all Europe in the last 10 years now. I want to bring here some points about the results of my studies that address the climate funding crisis from promises to performance. And in this case, I have analyzed almost 5 prime minister speeches in the last 5 years at the UN Global Change conferences. So in this frame, we can't talk about climate smart growth and resilience infrastructure without comforting a hard truth. Global leader promises often fail to materialize where they are needed most. So these 5 prime ministers that I analyzed, they are coming back from the UN conferences in New York, and they are zero reflecting their promises in their annual budgets of their governments. So they are just talking there, and nobody is caring about these promises that they are doing, or the promises on the on their also NDAs. The gap between the pledged funds also and delivered actions in the these multilateral adaptation funds also highlights the systemic inefficiencies in our financial system, global financial system on the climate funds. At this rate, the paperwork for climate funds might outlast the planet itself. So the other topic that I want to bring here is the bureaucracy and inefficiency of this bureaucracy on the climate funds. So my recent article at the ORF India explores how billions in climate fund are pledged, but only a fraction makes it past the maze of bureaucracy to reach the global south, our small islands, developing states. So these regions bear the brunt of climate impact, yet remain last in line for meaningful support. Their support is from 3 to 5% of these funds. The global south doesn't need more promises. Climate action, it's not just a New Year resolution competition, as the developed countries are realizing until now. What's next? It's the challenge of all the systems, because we are talking about innovative financing, green bonds, climate funds, debt reliefs. But how innovative can they be if countries must still navigate endless red tape? If multilateral banks and private investors truly want to make the difference, they must simplify processes and deliver faster. By the other hand, the big need in our countries is the accreditation of our own entities. What is happening in the Balkan countries that I'm coming from is that we are taking these funds through the accredited agencies, and they are there working, all the experts from developed countries. And in the Balkans, for example, we are just buying German expertise for Albanian reality. They are coming, they are seeing our country, they are taking their big budget salaries, and they are living. And so we are not able to build our own capacities, our own expertise on this, and how to realize that we can work on this in a sustainable way. So what we need is to consolidate fragmented climate funds into regional and accessible platforms. Why? Because they are almost now 8 adaptation multilateral global funds. Only 3 of them, they are allocating the half of their pledged funds. And only 2 of them, GCF and GEF, they are having touchable results for the adaptation funds impacts on the small developing countries. So what is happening with these funds? Why they are so fragmented? Why they have so big bureaucracies? Why we can't have these funds? They are there, but we can't touch them. And if we touch them, we can't have the results of our infrastructure, on our capacities, on our expertise. So what we other need is to cut the transaction costs and align priorities with the needs of the frontline communities and hold donors accountable to ensure resilience funding. It's delighted or repurposed. So what is happening with these funds, and what is happening every year that they are doing, or every 3 months that they are doing this board analysis or council analysis? They are just slogans there in all their plans, and they are multilateral, very expensive plans with slogans. But the time for slogans, I think it's over. Loss and damage financing must become a functioning systems, and delays cost, not just trust, but lives. So I think that we have all to work, not only for these funds and not only to realize to have more funds, but in the meantime, less much promises with performance and rhetoric of our leaders with resilience. The world cannot afford for the most vulnerable economies to suffer because of a broken system. And this is a broken financial system. So I want to thank you, and I want, if you need these data, you can find my articles and my researches on the ORF systems and ORF papers. And I think that except these conferences, we have to be more and more in our countries back, more, let's say, to push more our governance, not only for having the impact on these funds and having more transparency on these funds, but also to take measures how to bring our own capacities, not only to bring these funds in our countries, but also to have results, touchable results on our countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So that sort of gives us a lot of insights and links us to the previous presenter, the issues raised by previous presenters as well. We quickly now move to Dr. Marufa Akter. She's from Department of Global Studies and Governance, Independent University, Bangladesh. Over to you, Dr. Akter.
Thank you. I was thinking that I will be the fifth speaker, but it's good. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for be part of this conference. It's a very important one on the climate change. So I think the previous three presenters have covered a bit of about the impact and then collaboration, how it is affecting the people and the community of this region. So let me focus on a bit of geopolitical aspects. So if we look into this Indo-Pacific region, as the previous speaker also mentions, is a home to almost 65% of the world population and kind of accounts for 62 of the world's GDP. And this is the region also very crucial for strategic purpose, as 46% of international trade is going through this Pacific zone. Half of the global maritime transport is actually here. So now we can see that the importance of this region is a geo-economic importance, geostrategic importance, and which actually led major powers to develop, as we see, the Indo-Pacific strategies, which focused on national and regional interest. But at the same time, the Indo-Pacific region is one of the most climate vulnerable region globally, facing more frequently and intense natural hazards and such as typhoons, cyclones, extreme heat, sea level rise, as previous speakers all you have mentioned this. And also we have we have in this region countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Philippines are among the top 10 most vulnerable to climate change impacts. Because of this reason, this climate change is also exposing these countries to escalating resource conflict, migration pressure, and political instability. For instance, the coastal nations, such as if we look into the Vietnam and Philippines, face severe threats to urban centers, agricultural deltas, and fisheries from rising seas, and it actually amplifying that economic impact. And also it is causing kind of a dispute over scarce resources. Similarly, similarly, like Southeast Asian countries, particularly in Indonesia, we see how this climate change actually exacerbating the sovereign debt challenges, slow economic recovery, and undermine the climate adaptation effort. So the purpose of telling you this kind of a climate change, that it has a security concern, it has an economic security concern also, and also from the human security perspective. Also, this region, we have seen the countries like Kiribati and Tabulu confront existential threat from rising seas, right? So this also leading to mass migration, which has a regional consequences, and also it will have potentiality to stabilize the regional security. So these challenges actually demand kind of a robust international legal frameworks for climate displaced populations, because ultimately in the coming in the future, this is the thing that this region people will be facing, the climate induced displacement. So if we look into the geopolitical realities in this region, we kind of see that there are kind of a overshadowing the climate challenges, kind of, because this Indo-Pacific region countries remains very entrenched in traditional security concern, such as territorial dispute, military modernizations, which actually dominate the strategic priorities of both regional and global powers. For example, United States Indo-Pacific strategy, which emphasizes alliances such as the Quad to counter China's assertive tactic, while China's Belt and Road Initiative focuses on regional infrastructure investment, and often sidelining these environmental sustainability issues that we are actually talking today. At the same time, the disputes over maritime sovereignty, such as those in the South China Sea, this escalate regional tensions, diverting kind of an attentions from non-traditional security issues like climate change. So this militarized focus creates a kind of a policy imbalances where climate security is often deprioritize and which will have a far-reaching consequences for regional stability, because it established, the researchers have shown how climate can actually create a traditional security concern in terms of resource conflict, climate-induced migrations, and so forth. So these regions, if you look into, they have also emphasis on economic growth, infrastructure expansions, so much that they often prioritized over environmental sustainability. Of course, this create the climate vulnerabilities. And this is the real truth, that economic development is obvious, but it's very important to make a balance between this two. For instance, rapid industrializations and developing in the Pacific economies remains in fossil fuel intensive, right? Sidelining the climate initiatives. And then so regional corporations is also in this region. There are a couple of regional corporations took place, but they are also constrained by kind of a bilateral trust and the disputes over land, and also kind of a regional security threat, or also national security threat, is actually obstructing them to become a more fruitful regional corporations, because they give more importance on national interest. Having said that, there are also some promising climate security initiatives took place in these regions that I want to highlight. Although they were actually lacking of more effective, also often there is limitations, and that limits its effectiveness, but it still is worth pointing out. For instance, Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which actually include disaster risk reductions and climate resilience, with specific support for island nations and developing economics in South Asia and the Pacific region. Also, India is positioning itself as a climate leader through the National Solar Mission and frameworks like Sagar, emphasizing kind of a regional cooperation on maritime and energy issues. We have also South Korea example. And we have Quad, QCHAMP initiative aims to kind of strengthen regional resilience, although it often limits its effectiveness because of the geopolitical tension, but it's worth mentioning. And then also there's a Pacific Island Forum, PIF, which was adopted the Bow Declaration, identifying climate change as the single greatest threat to the region's security and livelihood. So it's it's a good initiative. These countries are coming to understanding the security risk, climate-induced security risk, and it's a risk to human life also. So what is important here in this region, more into redefine the security for climate resilient, and whatever we say, or we can say reimagining regional security. So there is a huge literature also on this topic, that traditional state-centric security paradigms are often ill-equipped to address kind of a climate-induced challenges. And when we are talking about climate-induced challenges, they are transcend borders, right? So this is not limited within the national periphery. It transcends, it has a cross-border effect, and it is disproportionately affecting vulnerable population, the population we are living near the sea. So there are several scholars like Chaturvedi and Vijay and Amartya Sen. They actually advocate for a shift towards a human ecological security framework, which actually kind of reintegrate environmental sustainability into the national and regional security agendas, because it's a growing need, and this is a time that we should talk about, because from the previous presenter we have realized that this is a huge impact on lives, impacts on economy, impacts on people's health, people's life, so and well-being and health, and so it is important to even the states, the states in the Pacific, especially including the big powers, they should come out from their priority from the security point of view, but rather focus on greater well-being of the community people here. So their approaches actually suggested that regional cooperation should prioritize human security and urging states to move beyond the narrow economic goals. Of course, economic is very important. We understand that, but we need to invest more in the climate resilience for long-term stability. And that should not be only the state-centric. It has to emphasize a kind of a collaborative effect because this climate has a transcendent impact. Also, we have realized that we have different policies, but there is a failure to adopt kind of a risk marginalizing vulnerable groups' voice into this framework, especially the regional framework, because these are the people, the most vulnerable. Their experience, their perceptions, and their own way of adapting the climate, the climate risk is also important, and it will give a voice to the regional level. Because of the failure of this, including the voice of the vulnerable groups, is exacerbating the tensions and also undermining the sustainable development across the Indo-Pacific. So it is imperative that we include, we redefine regional security issues, and this national security issues should incorporate climate resilience, moving forward, narrow economic development goal. Second, we also need to bring the human-centric approaches. So these human-centric approaches will value the environmental values, and this environmental value should be viewed in terms of sustaining the livelihoods and communities rather than as a resource for state power. So this is very important, and I feel like this is the way we should move away from the traditional concept of security of the nations across the Indo-Pacific. Third, the strengthening the regional governance. We do have different regional mechanism. It's also important to have a kind of a sharing experience. So effective and inclusive governance structure must be amplify the voices of vulnerable population while kind of a balancing power dynamics among the states. So this three is kind of a very imperatives at this moment, especially this 21st century when we are dealing of very unknown challenges. As the first speaker says that we know some of the risks, but every year the new challenges are coming into. So it is also very important that we do kind of a collaboration. So there is a need to rebalance the security priorities also in this region. The challenges of traditional and climate security, a kind of a rebalancing of the security priorities is essential here in this region. Regional cooperation, such as institutions like ASEAN and the Quad, emphasize multilateral cooperation to address transboundary challenges. So ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific promotes maritime cooperation to mitigate climate impact on fisheries and ecosystems, while the Quad climate change adaptation and mitigation package focuses on kind of a resilience building imperatives. You know,
Dr.
so
Akter, please wrap up. Your time is up.
1 minute. So we do have existing framework, and then we need to have there's a grassroots advocacy, so that needs to be connected. So in conclusion, what I would like to say that the Indo-Pacific region stands at a crossroad where there is an urgent need for climate security intersects with entrenched geopolitical rivalries that we are facing and experiences. So a sustainable future kind of requires reimagining security to include human and environmental well-being. So regional governance structure must be strengthened to ensure this kind of equitable representation and address the needs of the vulnerable communities. Next decade will be very, 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 very critical for placing climate security at the heart of the national and regional agendas. But it is obvious it is must needed things which can ensure the survival and the prosperity of the millions, almost more than half of the people in this region. And only through collaborative and inclusive and forward-thinking governance can lead the Indo-Pacific effectively to address the kind of a climate challenge the countries are facing here. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have our next speaker, who's also the second last speaker for today, Miss Genevieve Donnellon-May from
that's
Oxford.
right.
Yeah, hi. So she's from Oxford Global Society, UK, and she will be our next presenter. You have 10 minutes.
Yes, certainly. So thank you so much. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you all today. For this important discussion about climate change effects on the Indo-Pacific. And a special thank you also to the organisers for kindly extending an invitation to me. Apologies that the Zoom on my laptop isn't working properly. There's some kind of issue with the screen freezing, so I'll just have to do it without the slides and without the video, unfortunately. Also, I realised that much of what I had prepared for this important presentation has actually already been covered by the previous speakers. And so with that, and also the time limit, keep my remarks brief when speaking about the topic from the Australian perspective. And so to begin with, as we have already discussed, the Indo-Pacific is one of the most climate-affected regions on the planet. We see that there are more than half of the world's population living in the region, and it is also home to 14 of the top 20 countries that are considered the most vulnerable to climate change effects. Notably, we see that the Indo-Pacific is home to both the world's fastest sinking city, so that's Jakarta, and also the fastest sinking country, which is Kiribati. And we can already see the complete dangerous effects of climate change play out, whether that's rising sea levels, typhoons, floods, and droughts. All of these increasingly devastating climate change impacts are unfortunately putting infrastructure, ecosystems, and local populations at risk, and they're also exacerbating any existing social inequalities, and rapid urbanization is also adding to this situation as well. And so what we're finding is that many people in the Indo-Pacific, developing countries in particular, already live close to the poverty line, with their livelihoods heavily dependent on natural resources, and the effects of climate change are making this much more concerning and worrisome. And so there have been various estimates that we have already discussed today, and various projections, one of which is that by 2033, global temperatures could rise by up to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that would have even more devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific. We've already seen an increased frequency in disaster and severity of natural disasters over the past few years, and as previous speakers have already discussed, that the coastal and archipelago nations are particularly vulnerable to rising sea levels, and this also has a concern in terms of displacement and, of course, climate-induced migration. One of the key challenges with climate-induced migration is that it has the potential to not only strain resources, as well as also lead to greater instability, with millions of people being potentially forced to migrate from uninhabitable environments across the region, which could further escalate the region's existing challenges. Projections on this particular topic are really quite grim. And so one coming from the World Bank is that by 2050, up to 90 million climate refugees would be displaced throughout the region. And of course, this will put more pressure on national governments, and also in terms of the other governmental institutions that we have in the Indo-Pacific to be able to properly address this situation. So what can we take away from this so far? Well, from our discussion today, it's clear that climate change is a threat multiplier that intensifies pre-existing issues, whether that be food security, economic instability, some cases political unrest, as well as access to energy and resources. And of course, the socioeconomic consequences of climate change are going to be one of the more concerning ones. The same goes in the maritime security and in the maritime space, where it is predicted that piracy and transnational crime could increase significantly as a result of climate displacement, poverty, pollution, and ocean warming. And of course, these pressures are expected to further overwhelm state resources, leading to even more increased demands for maritime security efforts, including policing and disaster management. And of course, at the same time, the heightened pressure on government capabilities also plays a role in threatening not only the peace and stability, but also, of course, the prosperity of the region. As we have already discussed today, both financial and technical support for the Indo-Pacific is essential, as the regional impacts of climate change and the national impacts of climate change will be increasingly felt in the coming decades. Based on the climate projections, with a so-called business as usual scenario for many countries in the region, are incredibly dire, and again will exacerbate all kinds of existing challenges faced by the region. And so without robust financial support, noting, of course, as some of the early speakers have mentioned, the concerns that with the bureaucracy and that the hold-ups mean that the financial support is not actually being received by the countries that need it the most, that these nations may in turn struggle to adapt to the rapidly changing climate. And so where do we go from here? Well, from what we've seen at the recent COP29, that aside from national contributions from developed countries, and of course there was so much more pressure on developed countries globally to contribute more, to have much, to increase their financial contributions to different climate financing funds. There's also a role in public development banks. So that could be something like the Asian Development Bank, which help in terms of financing climate resilience projects. We've seen this all throughout the Indo-Pacific, and we see this in terms of, for instance, capacity building to help countries in the Indo-Pacific mitigate the effects of climate change and other related risks. So that could be one way that we could further encourage more climate financing that is more in line with what what those countries most vulnerable are needed. And then aside from that, in terms of what's next, well, from an Australian perspective, the Indo-Pacific does need a genuinely regional response to the increased threats posed by climate change. And so from Australia's perspective, the current government is looking at how to better involve countries, whether that's from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, and also from the Pacific, to ensure that all of these countries are having their say in some kind of forum where the larger nations within the Indo-Pacific are listening in. There's also concerns and also questions when it comes to when we look at from geopolitical perspective about the role of China, and if China could or will be playing a much greater role not only in the Indo-Pacific but also more globally when it comes to climate change, with Trump expected to pull out of all kinds of climate change agreements in his second term as the President of the United States. Of course, as we've already mentioned earlier today, the climate change does not stop at either national borders or political alliances. It's a global challenge, a regional challenge, and it requires coordinated efforts across countries, regions, and political divides. Now, as climate change exacerbates issues like poverty, resource scarcity, particularly in oceans, as well as political instability, unfortunately, we are more likely to see greater pressure on governments and on other key sectors to collaborate in order to address these challenges. As the previous speaker mentioned, both multilateral and unilateral cooperation could have a greater say in responding to the crisis. So that could be looking at existing organizations like the Quad or at the Pacific Islands Forum, could even be looking at ASEAN and so on. And so they can and must continue to play a more pivotal role in coordinating climate action and providing humanitarian support as well as technical assistance to all of those affected. The second point would be that research and capacity building programs that promote climate resilience development are absolutely essential for mitigating the impact of climate change, and that countries like Australia, in particular my home country, which has a strong education sector, can and should be better supporting these efforts as well. And finally, and bearing in mind the time here as well, to wrap this up, that strengthening these initiatives will not only protect the Indo-Pacific's vulnerable populations, but also contribute to the broader foreign and security policy objectives of regional stability and prosperity. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Also very happy as a chair that you finished in time. Our last speaker for today is Ms. Jayantika Rao, who's a research associate in the Delhi Policy Group in India. Over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. I would like to first begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate at this conference. As Genevieve has mentioned, a lot of things have been covered already, so I will try to avoid repeating whatever has been said. However, I want to just re-emphasize that by 2035, the average global temperature is expected to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was agreed during the Paris Agreement. Some scientists also suggest that there's going to be a rise of up to 2 degrees Celsius. And this is not about a far future that we're talking about. This is just within the next 10 years. There are other studies that are a little bit more pessimistic that talk about based on current national emissions, the commitments, and the actual progress, temperatures could range between 2 degrees Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius. And that's why I would like to just say that or reiterate that climate change is a global challenge. It affects every part of the world, but it also has a difficult experience for countries in the global south. It exaggerates the existing vulnerabilities and worsens development problems. As Dr. Marufa has emphasized in her presentation, the region is normally focused on traditional security, which ignores environmental concerns. But I'll add another aspect to it, is that climate change is also going to affect traditional security. A recent study that assessed the China-India rivalry talked about the implications of climate change on the rivalry, and the answers were concerning. So we can discuss that later on. As the previous speakers have highlighted, the Indo-Pacific is highly vulnerable to climate-related and other hazards, and this poses a huge risk to human security. Studies have suggested that the amount of people that will be displaced due to flooding in the Indo-Pacific is 50% for each additional degree of warming. And this is especially concerning because the region accounts for 70% of the global coastal population, and they live 10 meters below the elevation. And the Indo-Pacific also facing the highest relative sea level rise. Now, during a scenario exercise conducted by ASPE, it was hypothesized that by 2035, in a country like Indonesia, due to the sea level increase, the 1 in 100-year extreme floods that was rare is going to become an annual event. That annual event is going to cause large displacement, and this is going to be at least 2 to 5% of the Indonesia's population every year. Now that is going to create huge displacement issues for Indonesia and for the region. And as such, the Indo-Pacific is very vulnerable. And the unfortunate reality is that a lot of Indo-Pacific nations and their people rely on natural resources, which is at risk right now because of the climate change and the lack of action that is happening. Now, the increased poverty and reduced state capacity related to the predicted climate change will also contribute to the creation and the sustenance of a functional space which will allow organized crimes and networks to flourish. Now, while the relationship between climate change and transnational crimes are not unidirectional, there is a huge potential that the climate change is going to have an huge impact on the transnational crimes, like especially human smuggling and human trafficking. Now, human trafficking is largely driven by socioeconomic factors, and in marginalized areas, this is going to become exaggerated by the climate change related factors like drought, loss of soil moisture, flooding, etc. It's going to affect the livelihoods of many in the region. And as such, people are going to look for migrating options and look for something better for their families. And this will make them vulnerable for human trafficking networks, which are already in place in Southeast Asia and in South Asia. Human trafficking is deeply entrenched and interwoven with the world's more complex migration flows. And therefore, when we talk about climate change, we also have to talk about the transnational crimes like human trafficking. Another aspect to it is that climate change is not gender neutral, and women in particular are going to experience the negative effects of climate change much more. So, keeping in mind and trying to wrap it all up, I would like to just conclude by reiterating that climate change is intensifying and it will continue to intensify the existing socio-economic and ecological pressures that are feeding the regional mobility and human trafficking networks. Vulnerability will increase directly as populations are displaced and indirectly undermine human security. Natural disasters produced and exaggerated by climate change will increase the vulnerability by physically displacing people and creating a disorder that these traffickers and criminals can exploit. Thank you. I will end it here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you have allowed us. Also, together, all the speakers from 6 speakers from 6 different countries that you have joined from, you have been able to capture a big canvas of the issues that we have regarding climate change. We have one question which is there in the chat box, and I guess we can start by responding to this question. This, I think, is an open question, so any of you, or maybe a few of you, could respond to you from your own subjective positions. So the question is, what are the examples of successful climate change mitigation projects in the Indo-Pacific region? And how can these projects be scaled up to benefit the broader region? Any speaker can really respond to it, or we can have responses from different specializations. We had some examples from East Africa that were shared regarding this, but this is more specific to the practices in Indo-Pacific region. Now, before we respond to this question, I also invite speakers, if you have any questions or a comment for each other's presentation as a first round, in addition to the one question that we have, we can take the questions from the speaker's end to each other, or a comment to each other's presentation as well. Who would like to respond to the question that's...
May I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's a very broad question, and there are plenty of examples of successful mitigation project. Mitigation projects, you can categorize it based on whether it is the energy efficiency, whether it is your agriculture emission control, or whether it is, like, say, for example, different types of transport, whether you are using more the e-vehicle or the industrial your emission control and so on. I will just give one specific example, like in Japan. What we try to promote, of course, there are like broader aspects of the mitigation when you talk about your emission target reduction, and often this becomes the major focus for the negotiations, and those who are particularly joining the COP, the Conference of Parties, they will be able to know that. But in Japan, I think one of the very interesting aspect what we do, or some of the local governments are promoting, we call the 1.5 degree lifestyle. So 1.5 degree, yes, to target, although we know that we are possibly not being able to limit our emission or the overall global temperature changes up to 1.5 degree, but how with our own individual lifestyle, how we can make that 1.5 degree as part of our own lifestyle change. What does it mean? That we encourage using more energy efficiency appliances, Then we try to reduce the water usage. Then we try to reduce the waste, and also a little bit of the food habit change. Actually, I have a PhD student who is focusing on this 1.5 degree lifestyle and try to see that how much even of course it may look like that it is very small when we talk about the overall carbon emission, but I think it's more like a citizen-based approach, and bringing the incorporating this into different types of education processes, both in the elementary, junior high school, and high school. So my main focus here would be like the climate change is a shared responsibility. Of course, the government needs to do what they are doing, and that's where possibly we got stuck most of the time. But this, the example which I am talking about, this 1.5 degree lifestyle change, so that is more possibly a citizen-driven or the education, more basically on the education perspective. So, and those who are interested, you can just Google 1.5 degree lifestyle. You'll be able to see some of the documents. Thank you.
So any other panelists who would like to respond to that question? Because as rightly pointed out, it's very general. So we can have response to that from different positions as well.
Thank you, Ojha. Maybe I could also give it a go with regard to just energy transition and ensuring, or rather clean cooking initiatives. There are projects that I know of in Bangladesh and India, and whose target is actually aimed at providing LPG connections to most of the, or rather to about more than 50 million of people living below the poverty line. And the target actually is, like the Indian project, is where the government provides a subsidy to enable families acquire LPG gas. We all know that for LPG, the biggest investment is actually in acquisition of the cylinder itself, and now subsequent refills. So with various projects which sometimes include subsidizing the cylinder, and also ensuring that families are able to access LPG for clean cooking. And now this again, like I'd said before, leads to us protecting our forests, also reducing deforestation and greenhouse gas emission caused by burning firewood, and also reduce indoor air pollution, which actually disproportionately affects majorly women and children who are exposed to harmful smoke from traditional cooking methods. And this also, as a trickle-down effect, contributes to women empowerment, because remember, here we're freeing women from the labor-intensive and time-consuming task of collecting firewood, and giving them the convenience of fuel, or rather cooking fuel at a go. And here we allow them more time to do other productive activities. And this has been very successful, has been a really, really successful project. And the two countries I know of that run with this project is Bangladesh and India. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions in our chat box. So, and we have some time left. So, yeah.
May I?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm coming from Albania, which is a small country in Balkans, and we are 93% of our, more than 70% of our territory. It's mountains, and because of this, we are blessed by waters. But as every blessing, you have to manage it. And next to the communist area in my country, we haven't managed at all this blessing. So we haven't invested in the management of waters. And in 2011, the half of our territory was under waters, and it was the biggest flood period in our history. We lost lives, we lost animals, we had a big cost lost here. So we had almost 140 millimeters of water in 24 hours. And our annual rate of water, it's 1,500. So it was 1/10 of our annual floods in 24 hours. And we couldn't manage it at all. So we had big losses in our territory. But lastly, in 2021, 10 years later, we had done something very, very important. We had the early warning system working in our country at our emergency points. So, and we had a big management of a big cooperation between the central government and the local government and the inhabitants. And so we had almost 148 millimeters of waters in 24 hours. But we had, let's say, only a small part of our territory under floods. And it was just this realization. So the collaboration, we had done a strong collaboration under the Civil Protection Agency within the three components of all this. And it works. It seems that without big investments, but only with this kind of collaboration and the monitoring of all water systems in our country, it seems that it works. So probably we have seen that it's not only investments. Yes, we need the investments. Yes, we need to invest in the fire protections, in the flood protections and everything else. But without this kind of collaboration, it was impossible to find the way how these investments can be part of our own lives here and also of the management of the local and central government. Thank you.
We have another question, and this is Mr. Jamilon, and he's asking, how can Indo-Pacific nations strike a balance between climate adaptation and economic growth, particularly for small island nations and coastal communities that are disproportionately affected by rising sea levels and extreme weather events? Now, this is also something which no particular panelist has been the question is open to whosoever is ready to reply. So do we have anyone who would like to respond to this question? Am I audible?
Hi, I can say a few brief comments about that to kick us off if you'd like.
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, great. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, right? How can countries strike a balance between climate adaptation as well as economic growth? In Australia at the moment, there's a lot of discussions about renewable energy and what percentage of the energy mix renewable energy should be, especially when it has received a lot of criticisms for being unreliable, particularly our wind power. If it's not windy, how can we store wind power? How can we store solar power for at the times that we do need it? And when we're looking at things like the base load power and so on. And so that's one challenge. And then small island nations are another challenge. So the conversations that I am, sorry, I'm losing my voice, the conversations in which I have been a participant or a discussion in with counterparts in Pacific Islands have spoken about their concerns that they are already running out of time and that the situation is incredibly grave, and that there are discussions with their governments, the governments of the Pacific Islands, as well as the governments of Australia, to look at climate, migration and refugees and the percentage to which Australia, in its role as a regional power in the Indo-Pacific, can and should be accepting climate refugees as well. There are a number of discussions, particularly with the country of Tuvalu, so a very small country in the Pacific Islands as well. Similarly, in terms of coastal communities, that's another challenge. There's been a lot of discussions again in Australia, particularly along the eastern coast, which has burnt the brunt of climate change impacts, whether that has been severe floods, severe droughts, and so on. In terms of severe flooding, rising sea levels, and so on, planting mangrove forests has been one area that has received a lot of attention, and a number of grassroots and also community and NGOs are very interested in doing that, because this will not only help sequester the carbon and address climate change from that perspective, but it's also able to better protect the communities in there as well. I realise others may want to add to the discussion, so I'll leave it at that.
May I? May I?
Yes, please.
So I am seeing here these two concrete measures. The first, the climate resilient infrastructure, and the second, transition to renewable energies. And why? The coastal communities and small islands nations face immediate threats from rising sea levels and extreme weather events. So if they are having this kind of strong collaboration between the private sector, the academians, and the government, they will have to focus their job on building protective infrastructure. For example, seawalls, elevated roads, cyclone-resistant housing, and they have to ensure the survival of critical industries like tourism, fishing, trade, and safeguarding human lives. And their assets also. And the second one, it's a transition on the renewable energy, because they have this kind of dependence on expensive imported fossil fuels. And it's a significant economic burden for small island nations. So scaling to the renewable energy, solar, wind, that they can do this, reduces energy costs, enhances energy security, and also they will create local jobs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Akter had to leave for a meeting, so she's not with us anymore. There was a question. You might know that we are also live streaming in Facebook. So Dr. Akter isn't there, but I see a specific question for Professor Shaw. And this is a question from Facebook. Given Japan's vulnerability to natural resources, how can its disaster risk reduction strategy be adopted to help other Indo-Pacific nations? What lessons from Japan's climate resilience initiatives can be applied to improve the regional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that's a very, very important question. And we do some work on very specifically on this topic on Japan's experience, sharing it in the Indo-Pacific region. There are many examples, but let me give you a couple of them. One is like Japan has developed what we call the APPLAT, like which is the Asia Pacific Platform for Adaptation, and this is by the Ministry of Environment of Government of Japan, and where they have the regular meetings and sharing what you call the technical transfer mainly on different types of technology. There are many categories of technologies, whether it is for the energy sector, agriculture, infrastructure, and so on. So this particular platform actually talks about, if you just Google AP Plat, you will be able to do that. You'll be able to find that one and try to go a little bit deeper into that. So these are the regular, just the platform for sharing the technology, sharing the knowledge. In spite of that, Japan, through its ODA, provides different types of support system. One is the resilient infrastructure. So whether it is the critical infrastructure, whether it is the communication infrastructure, whether it is the connectivity infrastructure. So Japan has invested quite a bit on the infrastructure development in the Indo-Pacific, but now it's not just an infrastructure development, but climate resilient infrastructure, climate and disaster resilient infrastructure. And that's the very specific way within Japan we also try to do the climate and disaster resilient infrastructure. That's one very specific thing. Then I personally actually work with many of the Japanese Japanese private sectors, especially try to see the applicability of different types of technology. I just give you two examples on that. One is, as you know, that in many of the Asia Pacific region or Indo-Pacific region, we have this heat wave as a major challenge. So I've been working with one company called Teijin, which is almost an 100-year-old company, Japanese company, to develop some cost-effective uh, heat-resistant paint, which actually, if you just make the paint on the rooftop, it reduces the temperature, and I repeat it, 13 to 15 degrees centigrade. I personally had went to their specific experimental site where you have one part which is without any paint, another one is with the paint, and you can really feel the differences. So we try to use this type of paint in the school buildings, especially in many of the developing countries, then the government offices, and little bit costly paint is for also the public transport, like the buses. What it helps is actually helps also to reduce the air condition in the public transport, and that actually saves a significant amount of energy. And another example I give you, like I work with another small startup, which is called Headspring, and try to develop some very specific technique for high energy savings. Like when we have, as rightly mentioned, that Japan has lots of disasters, especially in the coastal areas, whether it is tsunami, whether it is typhoon. During the disasters, the public schools becomes, like, say for example in Bangladesh, also, like the schools become the shelter during cyclone. So in Japan also we use mainly the schools as the shelter, as well as the government offices. So we try to have this very small, the energy saving battery system, which in the normal time it is connected to the solar system, so it actually can store the battery. And during the major disasters, when you have the failure in the national grid, then this particular battery can run for almost 72 hours, which is the critical first 72 hours after a disaster, so that your hospital, then schools, then the government offices, that can function without any power disruptions. So these are some small technologies, and we are now trying to promote this type of technologies through, of course, one is this AP-PLAT, but also through different types of bilateral collaboration between Japan and other countries. Thank you very much.
Before I proceed towards the questions that have been asked to other speakers, Professor Shaw, there's a question for you which you have already answered in your while you were answering the previous question now. The other one is more in the sense of comparative experience. So the question is that if we look at climate change vulnerability in a small island nation of the Indo-Pacific and compare it to larger nations like India and Australia and Indonesia, what are the sort of differences in the issues?
Yes, thank you. I now see the questions. Thank you very much. It's very difficult to compare the vulnerabilities in small island nations with the larger nations like India, Indonesia, and Australia. The small island nations, we all understand, is the space problem is a major challenge, whether it is the Pacific small island nations, whether it is the Indian Ocean small island nation, or whether it is the Caribbean small island nations. And all of us, we understand, and every conference of parties, we see that how the small island nations actually appeal to different types of other larger countries, the major emitters globally, that there are no place like the climate induced migration is possibly the most prominent, most visible in some of the areas, some of the small islands where you have nowhere to go. So many times it happens that you go to possibly a larger nations, if it is an international migration from the coastal area, and leave your country. But it's a very complex dynamics, and it's not just leaving your place. Like, it has an tradition, it has the custom, it has the sort of connectivity with your roots in those small islands. So it's very complex actually, just to leave the place because of the sea level rise and move to a different places. On the contrary, the larger nations like India, Indonesia, Australia, at least the three countries which you have mentioned in this particular question, it has possibly a different types of challenges. While except Australia, India, and Indonesia, I think the high population is another major problem. Like, wherever climate change is impacting, whether it is in the northern part of the country, whether it is in the coastal area, whether it is in the very dry area, all these areas are impacted by different degrees and at different severity level. So there again, like we have seen that during like past couple of years, the heat waves in India has been extremely bad, and that had possibly, especially in the rural area, it has a huge amount of casualty. Not only just the casualty, also different types of human health impact, and also the other productivity issues like agriculture, severe water shortage, even in the major metros. So the complexity, it's a different level in the larger country. The complexity of the vulnerabilities in small islands, it's possibly more challenging, more severe, because of the lack of the land. What I'm trying to say, what I can say only that yes, the degree of severity is different, but maybe it's very difficult just to give you one answer which fits for both these different types of nations. But I think gradually in the global climate negotiations, we all understand the importance of the small island nations. There are different types of funding mechanism, but only funding mechanism will possibly not be addressed and not be able to address all the challenging issues, which are, we often say that the non-economic losses, like the cultural aspect, the traditions, they have to leave everything. So it's a very complex thing, which I can say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A very comprehensive response, I guess, and a lot of questions were addressed to you as well. Now I move on to the question that has been asked to Dr. Judith, which is from Facebook. How can Kenya's initiatives in the blue economy align with the broader Indo-Pacific efforts to promote sustainable ocean governance? You did mention there are lots of learning and unlearning that has happened from both the regions. But this question is addressed to you, Dr. Judith, and if you would like to respond to it.
Thank you for the question. And I think based on my area of specialization, I'll want to answer it from an angle of marine conservation and climate resilience and sustainable livelihoods, biased towards fisheries. And so Kenya has implemented several initiatives aimed at creating marine protected areas and restoring mangroves. These actually align with the Indo-Pacific efforts, like what we call the Coral Triangle Initiative. And for these, maybe coastal communities, like we talked of South-South cooperation in terms of information exchange, in terms of knowledge exchange, in terms of research, can exchange best practices with Indo-Pacific nations on management of marine protected areas and leveraging on ecotourism for sustainable livelihoods. Collaborative research, knowledge sharing on adaptive strategies, and access to blue financing would be a very important and very critical area of collaboration to ensure both regions build resilience to climate change. Again, also on the aspect of sustainable livelihoods and fisheries, Kenya continues to promote sustainable aquaculture, and a lot of initiatives are community-based with regard to fisheries management. And again, also this would also be an area of collaboration, whether it's knowledge exchange, it's information sharing, it's technology, issues around market access, and also sharing on good practices, best practices to transform livelihoods for both regions. And again, like I said, South to South cooperation is the way to go for the Indo-Pacific region and the global South at large to address the issues on climate change, because most of what affects the East African end of the Indo-Pacific is sort of replicated across the region. And when it comes to, again, livelihoods and the issues that affect sustenance for communities, it is more or less what happens across board. And therefore, collaboration to ensure that we are able to address climate change is one specific way that I think for me comes out very strongly for now Kenya and the Indo-Pacific, and also not just Kenya, but even the East African coast and the Indo-Pacific to collaborate and come together so that we can promote sustainable ocean governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And towards the end, we have two questions for Dr. Ornela. The first question is, how can countries of Indo-Pacific region draw upon international frameworks such as Paris Agreement to enhance their efforts in combining climate change while maintaining sustainable tourism and environmental conservation? And the second question then again to you is, with increasing frequency of climate-induced disasters in Indo-Pacific, how can nations strengthen their disaster risk reduction frameworks? Part of it in terms of finance you have already answered, but maybe you would like to expand that aspect further.
If possible, thank you so much. So what I'm thinking about the first is access to climate finance mechanism for sustainable tourism and conservation. Small islands, small countries. We are small countries with big problems and small budgets. And by the other hand, the governments, they are coming from the parties. And the parties, they know only one economy, the economy of votes. And the investments on the climate change, the investments on the environment, they are not producing votes at all, because you have to invest now and you have to take your investment back in less than 20 years or more than 20 years, sorry. So in this case, yes, we have to concentrate ourselves in other opportunities like GCF, for example. And I want to bring here the Samoa's case. They use the GCF financing to build resilience infrastructure, which protects both tourism and biodiversity. And this fund provides vital financing to develop climate resilient infrastructure, to restore ecosystems, and also to promote ecotourism. By the other hand, we have to enhance ecosystem-based adaptation for tourism and climate resilience. And I want to bring here the case of Botswana also, and they have the best maritime protected area because they integrated the tourism and the climate adaptation, created jobs and protecting the critical economic and environmental assets that they have. And they created this kind of cooperatives between with the all small businesses working on the area, and they are protecting themselves and they are investing themselves to protect these areas. And it's the best case how you can protect your areas, and you can develop the area also, and to produce in the meantime budgets on this and money of all this. And we are just in some the whole globe now, the whole planet now, it's under 60 elections this year. The biggest part of the global population, it's under election. It was under election. And I think we are going to a new area now. Yes, we are academians, and we don't care about politics, but politics, they care about the Paris Agreement, by the other hand. So if big nations like US, they are going and coming back from the Paris Agreement, what we will do with the Paris Agreement, by the other hand, and how the Paris Agreement is implemented in our countries. We have, for example, the Kigalis Protocol example. It was ratified by 198 countries, and now we are not talking anymore about the ozone problems in our planet. So it's working. It seems that if the all countries, they are able to work together on something, yes, it works. What we have for the next question, what we have to do for what we can do, the first one is strengthening the early warning systems, and it seems that in so many countries it's working on this. For example, I want not only to bring here my own country example, but also Bangladesh. Advanced cyclone has been the early warning system on this has been credited with drastically lowering death tolls during the major storm. So it seems that our focus on the early warning systems are cost effective and can significantly reduce casualties and economic losses. By the other hand, we have also to invest in resilient infrastructures, as I responded before. And there are a lot of cases here, a lot of examples here. How can climate resilient infrastructure minimize damages during disasters while protecting critical economic sectors like tourism, trade, and also agriculture? Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the presenters. Together, what we have been able to do is to map the issues related to climate change together. We have been able to identify the issues, but we have also been able to identify the areas where we have best practices that are already in place. It is one thing to say that climate change is the most pressing issue of our time, and nothing really in the contemporary time requires more collaborative effort than climate change. But this is also one area where we are failing ourselves collectively, in the sense we have not been able to come together as a whole. We also have issues where state, the territoriality have been one of the biggest hurdles. The question of territorial security many times really tosses the question of climate and related issues. But we have together in the panel been able to come up with several issues where there have been cooperations, learning and unlearning that have happened, and also possibilities of future due to the questions that were asked have also been discussed in greater details. Thank you to all the participants who have helped us to unpack a lot of areas. I know the time was really limited, but we hope that you will be together with us in the due course of this entire session and for further engagement with NICE, so that we can take up the issues, we can bring in solidarities, learn from each other wherever possible. Thank you so much to each of the participants. And I'm also extremely Thankful to the organizers of this event that you have been able to put up a panel like this. We did not see any overlap, as in everybody had different expertise, which meant that there was a possibility of covering as much ground as we have seen happening today. So congratulations to the organizers on that front as well. I'm thankful to all the listeners who have joined us here, not only through Zoom platform, but also in Facebook and other places where it is being live streamed. Stay tuned, be with us, be part of our dialogue now and for future as well. Thank you so much. Really a pleasure.